What's new?
I'm Zev Elef, professor of Jewish history at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Howard Rock, professor of history emeritus at Florida International University, someone who for a long while was a scholar of American history writ large and really came into the field with significant prominence with his Haven of Liberty, which was a part of a trilogy that was edited in 2012, I think, by Deborah Dash Moore, a colleague, a senior scholar in our field. In the tricentennial, in 1954, many federations and many Jewish communities commissioned local histories. So there was one of Los Angeles, of Columbus, Ohio, of Philadelphia, in New York, of course. There were several histories that were produced, Baltimore, Maryland, the South, the North, East, the West, and that was quite intentional. Each community on the 300th anniversary of Jews coming to the United States wanted to honor itself with a local history. But in some ways, you and the other members of those three books that produced this sweeping history of New York's Jews, I think set in motion a return back to these micro-histories, or these local histories. So there's been a recent wonderful history on the Jews of Baltimore, a collected volume that just came out a few months ago on the Jews of Cleveland, several histories on Jews in California that have appeared in the last couple of years. And that's really what's in vogue now, is not to understand the totality of the Jewish experience in the United States, but to texturize, to understand that each region has its own culture, has its own ethos. What were in terms of, in some ways, New York history and New York Jewish history has stood for American Jewish history, but your book doesn't do that. Your scholarship and several articles, your books, have tried to take New York Jews at its New York depth.
Yes, I'm a great believer in microhistory, but not in microhistory for its own self. I think the more you go into depth and you actually look at individual people and their biographies, and in institutions like different synagogues, you get a grasp of the whole culture, and through that you actually see that the only way you're ever going to understand things in general is to really understand things at the local level. There's no other way. Generalities are boring. People are interesting, and local synagogues are interesting. The controversies in a synagogue, the controversies in the Jewish newspapers, they're all so interesting, and they give you a flavor of the society. And from that flavor, you can understand Jews in America as a whole, because if you look at the different flavors, then you get a real sense of the whole. You can't do it any other way.
And what is New York about New York's Jews in the 19th century?
Well, I think one thing you have to remember is that New York was the center of the cotton trade. It was lived and died with cotton. It was almost like a southern city. And therefore, one interesting example is that the Jews of New York were very conservative and very pro-Southern. And that was, a lot of people think of Jews as progressive, and today most of them are very progressive. That was just the opposite in New York in the antebellum era. That's one aspect that you find of Jews. Jews in politics is a very complicated issue as well. Some of them didn't want to be in politics because it would make too much of a focus on them. It would lead to anti-Semitism. So there was that strain as well. But inevitably, they did become very involved, and there was a Jewish vote, it seems, as well. In terms of religious life, they reflected, I think, the temper of the times. There were huge numbers of new synagogues spring up. There was one synagogue in New York for the first 100 years, if you can believe that. And then suddenly there were 40 more in the next years, and divisions and conflicts. And there were some, only one Reform synagogue. But among the other synagogues, the splits were mostly among ethnic groups: Russian, Polish, German, Dutch. And there were also, and then there were conflicts within each. So that you had also interesting local situated synagogues. You had the synagogues of the wealthy, which were moving uptown toward Union Square and even beyond Union Square, which is 14th Street. And then you had the older ones, the poor ones, which took over the old synagogues down in Lower Manhattan. So you had some real class differences in the city as well. And you had Jews as a whole were not wealthy, but there were wealthy Jews. And they really loved to spend money on their synagogues because the synagogues represented their standing in society. So you had some of the most expensive religious buildings in New York were synagogues. Anshe Chesed, Shareth Israel, B'nai Yeshurun with a beautiful rotunda, and many of those. As the religiosity of Jews in New York was low, the synagogues were poorly attended, even if they were very well. And again, these are Orthodox, but they're Orthodox because there wasn't really anything else, but they really didn't attend very much. They didn't, for the most part, they were intermittent in keeping the mitzvot kosher, etc. And certainly on the street, they were very unlikely to maintain those laws. They wanted to fit in. Working on Saturday was always a huge issue, however, but most of them eventually did work on Saturday. Remember, there was no weekend there. It was a 6-day work week.
That doesn't happen until labor unions, really World War II.
Yes, that's correct.
Methodologically, from a scholarly perspective, what do we do? How do we situate local histories together? And how does it fit in to the tapestry of American Jewish life?
It takes a really good historian to do that. Someone like Jonathan Sarna, not many people have tried it. There was someone else's book I reviewed. I don't even remember it, but it was unsuccessful. His is successful, and he's able to pick the core of each community and try to find what is common and what is not common, and then put those together. Reform Judaism in Charleston and Reform Judaism in New York were exactly the same, although they had a lot in common and they had different roots and growing. And so if you're going to write about the rise of reform, you have to show the different areas, because you only have so much time if you're doing a mosaic. So it's a tremendous challenge. But
Charleston kept its own prayer book for many centuries. They borrowed from other liberal prayer books throughout the 19th century, but they kept their own model throughout. Whereas New York, it produced its own prayer books, its own sidurim, but it also borrowed from others. You're absolutely right. It's a different. Even the permeability of cultural sharing is different in various locations.
Early New York Reform, they just loved to write new prayer books. You're right. They wrote one and they wrote another one, and then Wise wrote another one. They were very active in writing prayer books. That's correct. The Orthodox, of course, did not, but it's fascinating to look at the prayer book in the, say, 1780s and see how similar it is to today's prayer book. It's remarkable. But the Reform, they were experimenting all the time, which was happening in Germany as well, of course. I mean, that was brought directly from Germany here. It was brought by Germans who spoke German. Most New York Jews spoke German really as the first language in the 19th century. I mean, after the German immigration, that was the most popular language.
What about in terms of thinking about the Jewish establishment in the 19th century? All too often, we think about the congregation, about synagogue life. Some, like Cornelia Wilhelm, have written about B'nai B'rith, fraternal lodges, but the synagogue still looms the largest in terms of establishment Judaism in the 19th century. That the field hasn't really moved away from that.
That is a really complicated question, because you could say, on one hand, you could say, well, they didn't attend a synagogue, so why is it important? But on the other hand, if you wanted to be anybody who was anybody, especially among the wealthy or the elite, you better belong to one. And that was important. It was extreme. Sometimes you read some of the things that are written about the synagogues, and especially in the Jewish newspapers of the time, and it seems like it was mostly a social thing. That's where on the holidays people dressed up, the unmarried men and unmarried women, it was a place to go to meet each other. It was sort of a single scene. For that age, and they knew, and according to one newspaper, they would come in late, but enough time so that they would afterwards be able to mingle and meet each other.
I don't think the synagogue has much changed since then.
Is that right? I'm not sure. That's my age. It's a little different. I don't observe. Unfortunately, I don't observe it anymore. There was of course, these are all women's gallery, but some people accuse the women of looking down or the men of looking up too much. Anyway. the synagogue was still, the New York synagogue, Shareth Israel, was the core of New York Judaism, everything. It was a synagogue community well into the early 19th century. Once after 1825, when you have the explosion of synagogues and the large immigration, you have local identification with synagogues, and you have, as you mentioned, B'nai B'rith, and you have unaffiliated, and it's different. There is no one synagogue. There is no one synagogue community. It's a multi-synagogue identity, and the synagogues, as you would expect, are often competitive with each other. So, in terms of religiosity, New York didn't even have a rabbi, as you know, until the 40s and 50s, and it only had a few. Didn't have a famous one until Morris Rafal came in the 50s, and he became very famous.
Sure.
Or infamous, sometimes infamous.
For some people, infamous, but he was at B'nai Shurin since really 1850 onward, and had, although he passed away in 1862, that, as you've written about him and I've written about him, a really interesting dozen years, as some people accused him of being the chief rabbi, I say accused because they didn't like him, the chief rabbi of New York, or sometimes of the United States.
So he was seen as a progressive Orthodox Jew. And then he comes to New York, and he becomes leader of the anti-reform group.
Staunchly anti-reform.
Staunchly. So he finds, I often wonder, no one's ever written a real biography of him. It'd be interesting to see that. I suppose it can't be done, but it'd be an incredible book if they could. And then he ruins his reputation by becoming so pro-Southern and writing a pro-slavery document that makes that, and that's what everybody knows him about, the pro-South rabbi who defends slavery, you know? They all were.
But we tend to write 19th century establishment Judaism using, as you point out, newspapers, and now so much of them are digitized, or using synagogue minutes. I think what you said is, I think, very provocative, that even if you didn't attend the synagogue, you were a member of the synagogue if you wanted to have a strong foothold in New York Jewish life, or really any type of Jewish life in the United States.
Wanted to go places.
If you wanted to go places in Jewish life, certainly. But there were other areas. There were other social organizations. I'm thinking about the Purim Association that Meyer Isaacs founded, I believe, in 1862. That was deliberately outside the synagogue. In fact, it was held for many years in Madison Square Garden and was almost anti-rabbinic.
Yeah, it was a showplace for the rich and famous. It was
Jewish or not Jewish?
Mostly Jewish. No, I'd say it was mostly a place for the Jewish rich and famous.
The mayor was there.
And getting a ticket to that was the most important thing in the world. It just showed the decline of among the elites of religiosity, really. And also, what I'll never forget about those is that they had a Purim in the middle of the Civil War, and they said, we're going to forget the war for a while. We're going to have fun. And what that showed, I think, was that a lot of Jews were turning against the war and against Lincoln and against the whole movement. And they were showing it by having this festive thing in the middle of this huge casualties and just the disastrous, the worst in terms of casualties, the worst war we've ever had. And the same with Rafal. He was gung-ho for a few months at the beginning, and he turned strongly against the war as well. And so did a lot of other Jews.
Right. So
not a happy picture to me, actually.
Certainly not, but it's a reminder about the context of Jewish life. And it's also what sources that we privilege in relaying that narrative.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And that's usually the art of the historian. What do you privilege? That's, that gets you into a lot of philosophical questions. What is truth and all that? Because it depends what you privilege is what your truth is. And politically today, there's a lot of issues on truth, as you know. And but you still have to believe, if you're an historian, that there is something of truth, even if you never get to it. There is good history and there is bad history. You have to. I think you have to believe that, or there's everything's relative and there's no values at all. That's personal opinion.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.